ahead.
Thank you, Shannon. Let me share my screen. It's in the right view.
Perfect.
All right, great. So thank you everybody for coming today. I'm going to do an overview of all the flood zones to put the coastal A zone in context. So this presentation has a combination of slides that CZM and DEP put together jointly to help educating people on land subject to coastal storm flowage and the building code. There's two different terminologies that are used, but the land subject to coastal storm flowage is the terminology in the for the Wetlands Protection Act standards that'll be coming out. Plus we'll also have the 10th edition building code. So the FEMA flood zones are broken down generally into V and A zones. The V zone is the area where you have a 3-foot wave height or greater, 3 foot of run-up depth or greater, or primary frontal dune. The A zone can be riverine or coastal, and it can contain up to a 2.9 foot breaking wave. So A zones are not just still water. There can be wave action, moving water. And FEMA has now broken that down into the moderate wave action area and the minimal wave action area. You're not going to see MOA or MIWA on the flood maps themselves. The way those are broken down is that they separate the A zone with the limit of moderate wave action. So the moderate wave action area is the area with a 1.5 to 3 foot breaking wave. And that's also known as the coastal A zone for purposes of the building code. So MOA and coastal A zone are interchangeable terminology that you're going to have to learn that those are equivalent. The minimal wave action area is where you have less than 1.5 foot breaking wave. So FEMA has determined through both storm damage observation and laboratory studies that there could be structural damage to buildings built to traditional A zone standards in the coastal A zone. And so that's why there are now new standards for that they need to be built to V zone standards. So the limit of moderate wave action is what delineates the difference between those two, and figuring out where that is and how to read it is one of the challenges. And that's what we're going to go over a number of different examples today so that you're more comfortable with that. You'll also see AO zones on the FEMA maps. Those are overwash areas with flow depths of 1 to 3 feet rather than an actual base flood elevation. And I do recommend using the FEMA Map Service Center to get your FEMA flood zone elevation and zone information, because that's where the most up-to-date information is with all the letters of map change. Some of the GIS viewers don't have live feeds from FEMA, so just going straight to the FEMA Map Service Center will show you all the map changes and have the most up-to-date information. Okay, so if we think about the flood zones in cross-section in a profile rather than on a map, you've got your velocity zones with greater than 3 foot wave heights out here, your coastal A zone or moderate wave action area with 1.5 to 3 foot waves here. And then this is the limit of moderate wave action, the LIMWA. And that's the symbology that they have on the flood maps, is this black line with the triangles. The triangles face the higher hazard side or the MOA side of the line. And so this is what you're going to be looking for on the maps to separate the coastal A zone from the MIWA. And that's one of the reasons for doing the MOA and MIWA terminology in the LSCSF regs, is because coastal A zone and the rest of the A zone sounds kind of funny, and people think or misinterpret that coastal A zone is all A zones along the coast, and it's not. So those are the 1% chance flood zones. And then of course, landward of that, you have the X zone, which can be shaded or unshaded. Shaded X zones are the 500-year flood, and unshaded is areas of minimal flooding. So your base flood elevation is the top of the blue line. That includes your wave envelope on top of the still water elevation. So if we look at it in a slightly different version of a profile, this is showing you the top of the waves. It shows you that where you have the 1.5 foot wave, that is where your limit of moderate wave action is, separating the coastal A zone from the minimal wave action area. And this is where your 3 foot wave height is. That's on a profile where it's the zone difference is based on wave height. There are other criteria, as I talked about in the first slide, so it does make a difference as to what your profile is and what kind of an area you are in as to what is the determining factor for the VA boundary. So some people ask about why we go from V zone to X zone in some cases, and why there isn't an A zone, because why would you go from a 3 foot breaking wave to nothing? Some of it that has a lot to do with the ground elevation changing very quickly. And so if the zone is too narrow, FEMA isn't going to show it on the flood map. So if it would be less than 80 feet on the ground, then they're not going to show smaller flood zones or narrower flood zones on the map. So in reality, yes, you transition, but it's just such a quick transition that they're not going to show it on the maps. This does not matter for regulatory purposes. If it shows as V zone on the map, you're in the V zone. That question comes up quite a bit. So some general points to consider about FEMA flood zones are that the maps are graphic representations of engineering data. They're not perfect. They're estimating where the flood zones would be based on some methodologies. Those methodologies are applied, and the detailed analysis is only done at specific transects along the shoreline. And this dotted line with the number at the end, that's a transect. So in this case, we've got one transect here, there's one here, and there's one here. In this case, there's a few on the same area, but they tend to be it's spaced out quite a bit. And so
Rebecca, just so you know, we can't actually see your cursor.
You can't.
No, I mean, I can see the mouse, but it's not moving. So when you say here, we're not able to see. I know that is weird. Just wanted to let you know that.
All right. Can you see that?
What is it?
No.
Oh, come on.
So if you just describe, I mean, I think you've described well what folks are looking for. And while I'm talking, if folks could please mute themselves. Thanks so much.
This?
Oh, there we can see. Yep, we can see that now.
Thank you.
Great.
Appreciate you pointing that out.
No problem.
So these dotted lines with the numbers are where the transects, and that's where the detailed analysis is done. So the folks doing the mapping have to interpolate in between the transects based on topography and site conditions. So there is some interpretation involved. The more detailed mapping can be done if you need that for a specific project, but that's just a general thing to consider. So when you're looking at flood maps and trying to figure out where the zones are, it depends a lot on the topography, the type of landforms you have. There's going to be a lot of different configurations of flood zones. So I'm going to go through some examples of what to look for and some of the things to think about. So in this case, we've got a velocity zone out here. The boundary between the flood zone is a white line. So this is your velocity zone, and this is an A zone back here. You also have the limit of moderate wave action shown, this black line with the triangles, and that faces the higher hazard side of the line, or the higher hazard, yes, the higher hazard side of the line. So in this case, this is your coastal A zone or MOA. And then landward of the LMWA is your MIWA. Now we've added a lot of extra labels to this to make it a little more understandable, but typically you're just going to see the standard FEMA labels. You're not going to see the MOA label, the MIWA label. You will see the LMWA and you'll see the white line, but you're not going to see all this extra stuff that we've added, these gray labels. So this is an area where you do have a transition from V to A and a MOA. But if you notice, the limb law changes over here, and it actually coincides with the VA boundary. That black line is on top of the white line, and that's because this is a lower lying area and this is a higher area. So in this case, V straight to A on the other side of the limb law, there is no coastal A over here in this situation. And that happens quite a bit along the coast. We don't always have coastal A. We don't always have MOA. So you've got to look for where the limb law is separating A from A to have MOA, MIWA, and a coastal A zone. Okay. So you can toggle the limb law off in the National Flood Hazard layer that's on the Map Service Center to look at where those white lines are and verify that it is in fact, that the limb law is in fact coinciding with that white line. So this is what it would look like when you toggle off the limb law so that you can see the white lines. But typically when you go straight from V to A and the limb law is right there, then you're not going to have a coastal A. And you'll get used to looking at that the more of them you look at. But that's just that's a tool that you can use in the National Flood Hazard layer. So another example, this is from Revere, where we have a seawall. So seaward of the seawall, we have velocity zones. There's a VE here, there's a white line, and then there's another VE. Then we have the limit of moderate wave action right along the seawall. And then behind it is MIWA. It's not a coastal A zone because the limb law is facing the higher hazard. The triangles face the higher hazard side of the line. There's no A on that side of the line, just V. So there's no coastal A zone in this particular situation. And that's because of the seawall, because the waves break. FEMA assumes that the waves break at the seawall, and that's why there's no coastal A mapped landward of it. So in the next scenario, this has got a couple different situations on it, where over here we have VE zone and then the limb law, and we go straight to X zone. And I needed cattail help, thank you. This is an area where the topography is changing very quickly. And that means, so you go straight from V to X. That means there's no A, there's no coastal A, no MIWA, no MOA, no coastal A. So it just goes straight from V to X. And then you're going elsewhere. Down here, where the topography is changing, not changing as quickly, and you have a lower area, you have a V and then an A behind the limb law, but it's still only MIWA. Your limb law is here. The higher hazard side of the line is the V zone, so there's no coastal A zone in that situation. Okay. Now, because of the transects being spaced so far apart, people do have the ability to file for letters of map revision or letters of map amendment. A letter of map amendment is just a reinterpretation based on more detailed topography of the current FEMA map. So someone may think that the line is a little bit different and they can apply with more detailed topography to get a LOMA. A LOMAR is when they do more detailed analysis at their location to get to reinterpret the flood zones, and that has to be engineering data and engineering analysis submitted to FEMA for a LOMAR. So it is possible to change the flood maps, but you shouldn't, local officials should not be using lower elevations of flood zones until there's an official determination from FEMA. So this is a situation where there is a letter of map revision. It shows up with this blue label, LOMR, with the date. That information of the details of that LOMAR is available in the flood hazard viewer. So this example of flood zones is a little more complicated. This is from Plymouth, and the complexity is due to the topography of the area. So we have a velocity zone out here. And then if you look at the limwas, there's one limwa coming through here. And then there's another one here. So as you move landward from the V zone and you get to this white line, that's your VA boundary. This A zone is on the higher hazard side of both of those limwas. And so that is a coastal A zone. That is a MOA. And then you go back to the white line here, you've got velocity zone and MOA. On the lower hazard side of the line, or not the side facing where the triangles are facing, you have MIWA on this side. So that comes along behind this limwa on the lower hazard side of it, and then on the lower hazard side of it here. So not everything is going to be facing seaward. It's talking about seaward and landward gets a little messy when you've got lines like this with the triangles facing technically landward and every which direction, but that has more to do with topography. So you just need to watch which way the triangles are facing to help you with figuring out where the coastal A zone is. In the next example, this is a situation where we actually get we go from a velocity zone out here. This is your white line that transitions to an A zone, another A zone, and then behind this A zone, there's a V zone. And the reason for that is that the waves break on this barrier beach, and then there's enough water in the storm going over the marsh over quite a distance here to actually regenerate a V zone to get back up to having that kind of wave energy. So in this case, it's not a simple V to A to X, it's your good V, A, and then back to V. Your limwa in this case is back here with the triangles facing out towards the marsh. So this is your coastal A zone here. Both of these A zones are going to be MOA or coastal A zone. This is V zone, and then behind the limwa, there's a small MIWA back here, and there's a MIWA back here. Let's look at another example where there's a little bit different configuration. This one has an AO zone. So this is on a barrier beach in Salisbury. And we go from a velocity zone out here. This is the limit of moderate wave action. And then behind that, there's an AO zone because you have overwash going over the backside of the dune. Because that AO zone is landward of the limwa, you do not have a coastal A zone in this situation. You just have a MIWA. So this is your V zone, and there's no coastal A or MOA in this situation. There's another example from New Bedford where we have a hurricane levee or flood barrier. In this situation, FEMA maps the velocity zone out here. The limwa coincides with the VA boundary, which is where the flood barrier is. And not only do you have an A zone back here, but you have this hatched area, which is an area of reduced risk due to levee. So in this case, your only MOA is not associated with the levee, but once you get past the levee, there's a small MOA over here, seaward of the limwa, or towards where the triangles point to, where there's an A zone between the V and the limwa. There is a small A zone there, so that is coastal A zone. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing for this part. One of the things that I want to do is when I'm just talking about the flood zones, it's easy to just watch and not necessarily think it through. But when you actually have to think about the examples, it makes you learn it a little bit differently. So I'm going to share this, but not in. Okay, why did that not work?
I think you need more help from the cat, Rebecca.
The cat needed to help on that one. I hit the wrong button. All right, so I'm going to share this in a different way, so it's not going to be full screen in order to do this. But we're calling this the quiz section, and Mia McDonald from DEP came up with this idea, and I think it's been really helpful for people to understand how the flood zones are mapped. So what I need is a volunteer, and we're going to play pin the tail on the donkey and figure out what flood zone labels go where, and it makes you think a little bit more, helps everybody think a little bit more about where you do and don't have different flood zones. So I need a volunteer.
You can raise your hand or just come off of mute if you're willing to do this. It will help everybody.
If you don't volunteer, I can pick somebody. Oh, come on. You guys can't be this shy.
All right, we got one.
Yay. Thank you, Dia. All right, so does anybody want to work with Dia to help her? You don't have to do this alone, or Dia can pick somebody too.
Ooh. Come on, somebody.
Shelley, do you want to help Dia? Or
oh, we got
Nadia.
Nadia.
Nadia, great. All right. So what I want you to do is one at a time, pick which one of these labels you want to put on the map over here. So you want to start, Dia or Nadia, which one of you wants to start? So you just pick which one of these labels you want to put and tell me where to put it.
I'll start, and I was a little bit late to this webinar, so I'm going to start with the easy one, the LIMWA.
Okay.
And I want to put it on the line with the triangles facing out towards the coastal VE zone. Yes,
right.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. Nadia? Which one do you want to put on the map?
Oh gosh, let's see. I'll put the seawall line. Would that be helpful?
Yeah.
And I believe that's the line with the two dots or the dashes.
Jeez. Sorry, I just moved the wrong thing. I definitely need cat help. So you think it's this line right here?
It's not moving for us, Rebecca. Oh,
there we go.
Now it did.
I think that's what it is.
Okay.
It's
all right. We'll see. Dia, you want to pick the next one?
Okay, sure. I'll do the MIWA.
Okay.
I was gonna maybe put the MIWA like behind the LIMWA, kind of where the town of Scituate is. Yes. Hey, how do you say that? Yeah.
Scituate.
Yes, Scituate.
All right. Nadia?
Sure. I will do the FEMA flood zone boundary between A and X. And that is going to be the white line between the MIWA and just sort of the aerial photograph.
Great. All right.
Okay.
Dia, which one do you want to tackle?
I guess we can do the MOA. And I would put it in between the LIMWA Scituate. Okay. I would put it between the LIMWA and I was gonna put it between the LIMWA and the seawall, but yeah, I think I'm gonna actually stick with that between the LIMWA and the seawall.
So you think it goes out here?
Where did that go?
We have not seen it move.
It should have moved unless there's a delay in.
Yeah, we see everything that's been done so far, but not this one.
Still not showing it moved?
Nope. Oh, it moved, but not to where it's not to where it's supposed to.
All right, so you think it's between the line with the dashes, the seawall, and the limwa?
I don't know, now I'm like, maybe there's no MOA here, but if I had to pick a spot, that would be the spot I'd put it on the map.
So you nailed it, Dia.
Oh, okay.
That was a trick question. In
yay.
this case, because the limwa is facing, you've got a V zone on this side, and there's no line showing an A zone,
Mhm.
there's no MOA.
Perfect.
You passed with flying colors. That's a trick question. And that's what we have in a lot of the area along the coast. So that's one of the reasons for doing this, is to actually look at it and think it through. So I think the other ones, are pretty straightforward because you got the tricky one. The A zone we've talked about being back here in the Miwa. The V zone goes out where the VE label is. And the flood zone boundary between the V and the A is coinciding with the limwa. Nadia?
Yeah, I just have a question. I'm wondering if I put the seawall in the wrong place, because when I actually look where that line goes on the aerial photograph, it goes out into the ocean. I think the seawall is probably on the beach, so it may be that thin black line. I
Exactly.
feel like that's usually called out on the FEMA maps, but obviously it's not called out on this
Yep.
portion of the map.
You got it. So it is that thin little black line. If we go to the answer for this one, usually when you zoom in somewhere along the line, it will call it out because this was zoomed out so much, it doesn't show it. But that thin little black line is the seawall. There usually is a label somewhere on the flood maps. This black line with the dots causes all kinds of confusion. It's a kind of a baseline for FEMA, and my suggestion is to just ignore it. It's really not helpful. So I think you two did a great job. You caught the fact that we don't have a MOA in this case, and that's the trickiest thing to realize when you're looking at these maps. So if we can, thank you very much, Dia and Nadia. Go on to the next example. And this one, I won't necessarily ask for volunteers because I think we just covered the main point in this one, in the last one, which is when you go straight from a V to an X, you don't have an A zone. And that is really the main point of this example as well, is the fact that there's just no A zone. So you're not going to have a coastal A, and you're not going to have MIWA or MOA. So that happens a lot along the coast. And you just want to keep an eye out for that when you're looking at maps.
I don't think the slide advanced, Rebecca. We're still on the game slide, which does have all those things that you said were
So
not in the picture.
The Rockport example?
No, we're still on
Situate.
Situate.
But we saw the seawall label move.
All right.
Maybe try unsharing and reshare.
Let's try stop sharing. Why do I have 3 versions in Windows already? This is weird. Computer, you're not supposed to do this stuff to me. All right, now can you see Rockport?
Nope, still seeing Situate.
Okay. I'm going to close PowerPoint and make it behave. Sorry about this, folks.
Wouldn't be a virtual meeting without some technical difficulties. While Rebecca does that, I'll just reiterate what she said early on, that the language that she's using corresponds to the Wetlands Protection Act and is used for conservation commissions. In the building code, we'll be using coastal A zone, and then what I've been saying is just regular A zone. So coastal A zone is the MOA, the moderate wave action zone, and then the quote regular A zone is the MIWA, the minimal wave action zone. So just a reminder for folks as we go through this. Now we can see Rockport.
Okay. So this is an example where we go straight from a velocity zone out here to an X zone back here with a limb Y in between. So there's
Back
no
to not
A
being able to see
zones.
your cursor.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
I need to do a little laser pointer. Teams. So B zone out here, X zone back here, limb Y in between. So there's no A zone labels. There's no A zone between the limwa and the NB. So you don't have coastal A zone. You don't have MOA, no MIWA, none of those. You just literally go straight from B to X. So that's one of the things to keep an eye out for along the coast, is there's a lot of areas where there is not a coastal A zone. And, you know, once you spend a little bit more time with your maps, if you have some questions, feel free to reach out. We try to help people figure out complicated areas.
Rebecca, Joy
Sometimes,
has her hand up if Joy wants to jump in on something there.
sure, Joy.
Yeah, hi. Just for clarification on that. So even though the limwa is shown on the map, everything seaward of that limwa is V zone, correct?
Correct.
All right, thanks.
Yep. So because there's no A, here, this is one of those situations where I talked about in the beginning where you go straight from V to X because the topography is changing so quickly. So you don't have any A. And if you don't have an A, then there can't be a coastal A, a MOA, or a MIWA.
Do you have insight into why they used the limwa line then instead of just the regular VA line? Is it because there's a less than 80-foot coastal A there?
Well, it's because we wanted the limwa shown everywhere. So when we updated the FEMA flood maps, we wanted to make sure that there was a limwa everywhere because people need to be able to see that for regulatory purposes. So if you want to verify the fact that this is coinciding with that VA boundary, you can toggle off the limwa. But we felt because the coastal A was going into effect in the building code, that it was important to have the limwa everywhere along the coast. Does that make sense?
No, but that's okay.
Thanks, Joy. So when you're delineating flood zones on on a site plan, there's a couple different ways that you need two different methodologies to use depending on which boundary you're delineating. So if you're going from a velocity zone to an X zone, so one example of that is V zone to X zone here. Or if you're going from V to A, if you're trying to delineate one of those two boundaries, that is, I'm sorry, I just did that wrong, didn't I? No, I'm sorry. So A to X or V to X. So if you're going from V to X or from A to X, then you are at the landwardmost extent of the floodplain. And that is where the water is tapering out as you move landward, and it tapers out at that base flood elevation on the ground. And so you should be using best available topography to figure out where exactly that floodplain would be on the ground. The best available topography was used in a lot of cases, and sometimes those lines shown on the map don't coincide with the ground elevation like they should. As we get FEMA map updates with more detailed topography, hopefully that will get addressed. But that is one of those things to keep in mind. There's the methodology is for doing that is described in more detail in the coastal manual, which is available online on DEP's and CZM's websites. And I can put a link to the chat in that once I finish
I
presenting.
just put it in there.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So if you are going from V to A, B to A means that you're aware there's a 3-foot breaking wave transitioning to less than a 3-foot breaking wave. That flood zone boundary is not going to occur. The elevations are not going to correspond with any ground elevations. So that does need to be scaled onto the site plan. And you use the same methodology to delineate the LIMWA line. That should be scaled onto the site plan as well. So an example of what that would look like on a site plan, if you're looking at, and I know you're not all going to be able to see the numbers on the site plan here, but we've got a VX boundary. And so in that case, it's the landwardmost extent of the floodplain, and it should be put at the base flood elevation for the flood zone, which is 15. And they put this line seaward of 15. 15 is back here. So it should be moved back to elevation 15. So it's not a huge difference. It's just being accurate. Okay. And I'd be happy to take questions if there's any more questions about how to figure out where the coastal A zone is.
While folks think of questions, I also just want to note for folks who are especially regulating this, if you're using your town GIS program systems, this needs to be added. Most towns do not have the LIMWA line on there. Also, this will not make sense to some people, but if you're familiar with GIS, the LIMWA is just a line. It is not a polygon. So it's a different shape, but you can create the shape file, basically create polygons. If you want that, if that doesn't make sense to you and you want more information, feel free to reach out to me. We do have some of that data here. It's not the official map. You still should go to that National Flood Hazard Layer, as Rebecca has said, but that's a good first stab for folks who use their town GIS to find out what zone a property is in. That's really helpful and good to know it's probably not in your town GIS right now. Okay, we do have some questions coming in.
And if you're reviewing site plans, you want to make sure that they are putting the LIMWA on the plan.
Yes.
Because if they're just downloading from a GIS viewer and taking the GIS layers, they may not be taking the LIMWA either. I've been seeing a lot of site plans without LIMWAs on them.
Yes, great point, Rebecca. Thank you. Okay, so we do have some questions coming in to the chat. All right, I'll take Nadia's easier question first. Will we get a copy of this training after the webinar? Yes, it is being recorded and we can make the slides available. Okay, so Thad asks, what happens when you have a VE based on splash? You end up with a VE elevation in the 20s or 30s, but ground topography is often substantially lower and the 2030 elevation is far more than 80 feet beyond the boundary.
I'm not finding that question.
It's in the chat at the bottom.
Oh, you're okay. So the splash zone is something that is based on they can either use the 30-foot or they can do it based on the actual information they have. So FEMA has a couple different methodologies that they use. But the splash zone is going to move your VE zone landward of the seawall. That doesn't change where it's just going to move your VA boundary. It doesn't change your LIMWA. Does that make sense?
That'll have you answer that.
So the 80-foot that I talked about for the A zone, the invisible A zone, it has nothing to do with your splash zone. FEMA's moving the V zone further landward of a seawall to recognize that you have high hazard conditions extending landward of a seawall, and they really shouldn't be ending the V zone there.
So Thad's, Eric, go ahead.
I think what Thad is talking about, Rebecca, is something that you and I spoke about last week, maybe in the meeting that we had about priorities going forward with building code requirements. There are situations where using the V-zone elevation takes you way beyond that 80-foot 80-foot invisible A zone that you talked about. When there is a V-zone, X-zone boundary, sometimes on a steep slope, using that methodology you described of taking the V-zone elevation and extending the boundary to the contour. Sometimes that works. Sometimes, like Thad just mentioned in the chat, sometimes it takes you 1,000 feet inland from where the V-zone boundary is shown on the map. So the methodology of using that V-zone elevation doesn't always work. And we need to have some other way of establishing that boundary in those situations. Typically, the way FEMA looks at this is what they've said, and they've said it repeatedly, is the line on the map is the boundary. And, you know, however you establish that, that's what you use to meet FEMA's requirements for what is and what isn't in the V zone.
Yeah, I think there are some limited cases where they're having that issue with the going a lot further landward. So for flood insurance purposes, people are supposed to use the lines on the map. But in a lot of cases, what we're seeing is we just need to get a little bit more updated topography to more accurately figure out the floodplain for the purposes of the flood zones, particularly under the Wetlands Act.
I would add that for building code purposes, the line on the map, what's shown on the map is what should be used.
Correct.
Thank you both. As everybody can see, this gets complicated.
Mm-hmm. Does.
Do we have other questions about the LMWA or delineating flood zones? Sorry, Melissa asked, is there a resource or list available that we can share with engineers about these new requirements for flood zone delineations on site plans, or should we make our own? I would say probably don't worry about making your own. Is there one that exists? If not, I'm sure there'll be one forthcoming, right?
New requirements about delineating flood zones. So what I talked about how to delineate the flood zone on site plans is in the coastal manual that Shannon put in the chat. That is guidance for Concons on how you should be delineating it for land subject to coastal storm flowage. If you have circumstances, there are some limited ones that have occurred where it's, 1,000 feet difference. Those are some unique circumstances we need to take a look at, and there is technical assistance available to you. As Eric said, for purposes of the building code, the line on the map is the legal line. But the coastal manual that Shannon put in the chat is the guidance for how to do it under the Wetlands Protection Act.
Thank you.
So if you go to the land subject to coastal storm flowage delineation chapter, which is chapter 2, the section for land subject to coastal storm flowage has that information. I also just put in the chat, there's a recording of a longer version of this training that DEP and I did together. It's available on DEP's website. So if you want to go watch that again in a longer version, that's available as well.
Great, thanks for putting that in there. Any other questions? We're also, Rebecca's available, Eric's available, other folks with DCR, myself, we are all available as you run into these things in your communities. We can help answer those questions. All right. Seeing no others. Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's very, very helpful. Thank you. Okay, next we will move on to Eric Carlson, who is going to tell us about applying new building code standards in these flood zones. Go ahead, Eric.
Hi, it's going to take me just a minute to share my stuff.
No problem.
So So please indulge me for a minute because
No
I
problem.
have everything open. Okay, so
There we
here's my
go.
first presentation. It actually, there is some lag between the point at which I hit the little button to put it in presentation mode.
Okay.
So bear with me. And right now, unfortunately, that little place to put it in presentation mode is not showing up on my, oh, there it is. The little Teams bubble was on top of it. So
Aha.
I've clicked on the link or on the icon and it's not there yet. So
But it
I'll
will
click
be.
it. It will be. I might have to click it. Yeah, there it is.
Great.
So,
Yep, we can see it too.
okay, very good. So I am going to be talking about 10th edition building code standards. I'm going to start out with A-zone standards. And after that, I will go into V-zone standards, coastal A-zone standards, and coastal dune standards. I'm going to talk about more than just what the changes are for the 10th edition, just in order to provide context for what those changes are and what those mean. I don't think it would be helpful if I just said, we changed this from this to that. It would only take me 5 minutes to do it, and I don't think you'd get much out of that. So anyway, mostly I'm going to be talking about residential code standards. I will stop here and there to interject something about the base code standards. So here we go. 44 CFR 60.3, minimum standards for National Flood Insurance Program. Here's where everything starts. These are FEMA's regulations, sometimes referred to as National Flood Insurance Program or NFIP regulations. These are the standards that have to be met by any community that participates in the National Flood Insurance Program. So here, these standards include standards for construction of buildings, but also some other standards as well. Most of FEMA standards are about construction of buildings. And in Massachusetts, because we have a uniform building code, for those standards to be enforceable, they have to be in our building code. So here's where we start, 44 CFR 60.3. The I-code series, our building code is based on the I-code series. The 10th edition is based on the 2021 I-code series. I have up here the IRC and the IBC. These are the two volumes I'm going to be talking about most. There are some other volumes out there, and those also have some flood standards, but mostly where those standards appear, for instance, in the existing building code, the standard just refers the user back to the base code. So I focus mostly on the standards that appear in the IRC and the IBC. It should be noted that the I-code series is written with the specific intent of being compliant with FEMA standards in the National Flood Insurance Program regulations at 44 CFR 60.3, and FEMA has accepted these standards as meeting their requirements. So that's important to know. In a lot of ways, the I-code standards are more protective than FEMA standards, but at a minimum, they are consistent with what FEMA requires. And next up, reference standards, ASCE 2414 and ASCE 7. Those are both reference standards, and you'll find them in both the residential code and the base code. So under the base code, ASCE 2414 is a required standard. A lot of times I will say required rather than referenced standard, because referenced makes it sound to me like, you know, it's a suggestion. But the base code specifically says that new construction, this is in Chapter 16, Section 1612. It says new construction and substantial improvement of buildings shall be in compliance with ASCE 24 and Chapter 5 of ASCE 7. So they are required standards. Under the residential code, ASCE 24 is an alternate standard, so it can be used, but doesn't have to be used because residential code has prescriptive standards which spell out all of the requirements, unlike the base code that references back to ASCE 2414. Again, like the iCode series, ASCE 24 was written and developed in order to be consistent with FEMA's standards. So, and like the iCodes, in many ways, is more protective than FEMA's minimum requirements. So, in the end, we have the Massachusetts Building Code, 10th edition residential volume, 10th edition base volume, which, like I said, we have adopted for the 10th edition, the 2021 iCode series, with amendments. So Massachusetts has amendments that are added to the iCodes to ASCE 24. And it is important that you always reference the amendments because there's lots of amendments in the flood standards. So keep that in mind. Now, this creates a situation which can be confusing at times because FEMA's standards and the iCodes and ASCE 24 very often, even though they're supposed to be consistent with each other, the standards themselves are written, they're worded differently, and there's different terminology that's used. FEMA's standards use different terminology from what you will very often find in the iCodes in ASCE 24. And in Massachusetts, in our 10th edition building code, some of the terminology that we use and that we've introduced by amendment is different in the residential code from what's in the base code. So I will go over some of that as I go through the presentation and just point out some of the difference in the way things are worded and differences in the terminology that is used. So here we go. Building code standards. I'm going to start off with A-zone requirements. And like I said, I'm going to follow the residential code mostly. In the residential code, you will find most of the flood standards in these chapters. Chapter 1, scope and administration. Chapter 2, definitions. Chapter 3 is where you're going to find most of your building standards, in particular in section R322, flood resistant construction. And then chapter 4, foundations. There is one kind of important note, and I'll get to that as I go through the presentation. I always bring up what it says in chapter 4 because it's important to know. So here's some terminology that's used in the residential volume. The term flood hazard areas typically refers to A zones. And when I say A zones, I mean any zone beginning with the letter A. So that could be an A zone, an AE zone, an AO zone, an AH zone. And there might be some more, but I don't typically see those on the maps that we have here in Massachusetts. Coastal high hazard areas specifically refers to both V zones and coastal A zones. Now, this is different from previous versions of the building code. In previous editions of the building code, we did not have specific standards for coastal A zones. Coastal A zones were treated like any other A zones. That has changed. I will go over those requirements. Coastal dunes, we have standards for coastal dunes in both the residential code and the base code. Coastal dune standards are unique to Massachusetts, so you will only find those in the Mass amendments. Like I say, make sure you're looking at the mass amendments to make sure you have the correct standards to be used in any situation. Now, design flood elevation, and base flood elevation. Here's where there are some differences between the residential code and the base code. In the residential volume, by amendment, we have defined the design flood elevation to be equal to the base flood elevation plus required freeboard. And I will go through that again as I get there. In the base code, design flood elevation equals base flood elevation. So the standard that you will find in ASE 24, and we've amended the freeboard requirements in the mass amendments for the base code chapter 16. So in ASE 24, they will talk about base flood plus freeboard, or design flood plus freeboard, whichever is higher. And by definition, in the base code, base flood elevation equals design flood elevation. It's confusing. I hope I can clear that up rather than causing more confusion, but I think you'll get it as I move through the presentation. Okay, pardon me, I have a pop-up in my screen that I have to get rid of. Okay, very important definition to know. This is not a change. This has been consistent in the 8th, the 9th, and now the 10th edition building code. Definition for lowest floor and basement. This is going to be in the mass amendments. So the term lowest floor and the term basement are both defined terms. It's important to know those definitions in order to understand the standards. So lowest floor is the lowest floor of the lowest enclosed area, including basement. It does include some enclosures, provided that they meet a bunch of those other things that it says there on the screen, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, but that's lowest floor. Basement. A basement is a portion of a building, an enclosure that is below grade on all sides. So important to note here is that first of all, this term only applies to this section of the building code. That's one thing, but it does not mention what the height of that enclosure is or how much below grade it is. So any enclosure that is below grade on all sides is by definition a basement. It might be 4 feet in height. It might be something you'd want to call a crawl space, but for this part of the building code, this flood resistant construction part of the building code, a basement is an enclosure that is below grade on all sides. And remember, because of the definition of lowest floor I just went over, whenever there is a basement, that basement is by definition lowest floor. Okay, and I'm trying to advance. Here we go. So these standards, the flood-resistant construction standards, apply to new buildings and substantial improvement of existing buildings. So substantial improvement you will not find in the definitions. In chapter 1, substantial improvement is established as a procedure. So I didn't put the whole thing up there on the screen because it would take a couple screens, but to sum it up, substantial improvement means any improvement, including an alteration, an addition, a renovation, a reconstruction, any improvement, the cost of which equals or exceeds 50% the value of the structure prior to the improvement. Okay, so this standard applies to new construction and substantial improvement of buildings. It applies to a couple of other things, and I'll talk about a couple of those other things as we get into the standards, but substantial improvement you will find right here in chapter 1 in that section that I've given you a citation for. This is a mass amendment, substantial repair of a foundation. So the standards apply to substantial repair of a foundation also, and that would mean when work to repair or replace a foundation results in, as you can see there on the screen, I won't read the whole thing, repair or replacement as measured along the perimeter of the foundation of more than 50% of the perimeter. That's a substantial repair of a foundation. Or for a pile foundation, repair or replacement of 50% or more of the piles, columns, piers, and so forth. Okay. Prior to issuing a building permit, there are specific documents that are required that might not be required when you're not in the floodplain, but they are required for any new construction, substantial improvement, or substantial repair of a foundation. And the construction documents include stamped building plans. So you have to have construction documents prepared and sealed by a registered design professional. You need that for residential construction that's in the floodplain. Some other things that are required include delineation of flood hazard. So that would include flood boundaries, flood elevations, proposed elevation of the lowest floor, including basement, because definition of lowest floor always includes basement. For a V zone, it would be elevation of the bottom of the lowest horizontal structure, structural member supporting the lowest floor. And if you don't have flood elevations available, you have to get flood elevations from some other place. So you need all that information for issuing a building permit for any of the things I talked about that are in the floodplain, whether it's an A zone or a V zone. You need that stuff. Okay, so actual construction standards. Establishing the design flood elevation. I mentioned before in the residential code only, the design flood elevation is defined as the base flood elevation plus the required freeboard. So in the 10th edition, that has changed. In the 9th edition, required freeboard was plus 1 foot. So in the 10th edition, it is now base flood elevation plus 2 feet in A zones. Okay. That's important to know because when you get to the actual standards, it's going to use some of these terms that I've defined. So the very most basic requirement for construction in an A zone is right here. Buildings and structures in A zones shall have the lowest floor elevated to or above the design flood elevation. I just want to point out here too that a lot of these code citations, I'm giving you the correct code citation where to find this standard. In some cases, I have summarized some of the language in the standard just so that I can kind of fit it up on the screen. In all cases, refer to the building code, including the amendments, to make sure you're getting the correct language of that standard. So let me just point out again. Buildings and structures in A zones shall have the lowest floor, which is a defined term, elevated to or above the design flood elevation. Remember, lowest floor, the definition always includes basement. So if there's a basement, that is the lowest floor. And design flood elevation, again, defined, that's base flood elevation plus 2 feet in the residential volume. So here's a picture of a structure under construction in an A zone. I like to use this picture. It's fairly recent. Note that it does not have a basement. It has a slab that looks like it's about 1 foot above grade. This was permitted under the 9th edition, I'm certain, back when the requirement for lowest floor was base flood elevation plus 1 foot. But here is a good example of what would appear to be a compliant structure under construction in an A zone. So in AO zones, I didn't have a mapping presentation. An AO zone is like any other A zone, except it doesn't have a elevation given on the flood insurance rate map. It has a depth. So it has to meet the same standards. Elevation requirements continued. Basement floors that are below grade on all sides shall be elevated to or above design flood elevation. Remember, a basement is defined as an enclosure that's below grade on all sides. So it sounds a little bit redundant. I tell people, generally speaking, in A zones for any residential construction, you cannot have a basement. There is an exception, and that would be if fill is used. If fill is brought into the site, there might be a situation where you could have a basement for a residential structure in an A zone, but that basement has to have its basement floor elevated above design flood elevation. And of course, if you're bringing in fill, you have to have approval for bringing in that fill. Kind of goes without saying, but I like to say it anyway. Enclosures below the design flood elevation. So you can have an enclosure below an elevated building. Your lowest floor in an A zone has to be at or above design flood elevation. Below that, you might have an enclosure. It might be something like a crawl space. This is allowed provided that certain requirements are met. And right there, it says, enclosed areas that are not basements shall meet these requirements. So the use requirement is these enclosures can be used building access, parking, and storage. And number two, that's really important. It has to have flood openings or hydrostatic openings to allow equalization of hydrostatic pressure. So those openings have to meet the following requirements, and there's a whole bunch of them. So it takes me a couple of slides to go through them. The openings have to have a total net area of 1 square inch for every 1 square foot of enclosed floor space. That is to meet the prescriptive requirements. You might also have engineered openings. Engineered openings have to meet that section of ASCE 24. And some of the openings that you can buy, like ready-made openings, like for instance, just to mention a brand name, a smart vent, those are considered engineered openings. Keep that in mind. Openings can't be less than 3 inches in any dimension. Some more stuff about openings. You have to have a minimum of 2 openings on 2 different sides of the enclosure, and the bottom of the opening can't be more than 1 foot above the higher of the interior grade and the exterior grade. Here you see down here, it has to be not more than 1 foot. It can be less than 1 foot, but it can't be more than 1 foot. Sometimes you might want it to be less than 1 foot because you really want that opening to be lower than the base flood elevation, because the opening is not going to serve its intended purpose if it's higher than the flood elevation, or it's not going to serve that purpose well. So you can have those openings less than 1 foot above the higher of those 2 grades, and it's usually a good idea if you do have it less than 1 foot above grade. Okay, some more stuff on openings. Openings can be in doors or garage doors or windows, but the doors or the windows do not count as openings unless there is an opening installed in that door or window. And they do make over-the-counter, off-the-shelf openings that are specifically designed to be installed in doors or garage doors. So that can be done. Protection of mechanical and electrical systems. I'm going to sum this up. Utilities such as furnace, water heater, plumbing fixtures, duct work, all of that stuff, electrical work, shall be elevated above the required level of protection. It doesn't say specifically what that is here. It says above the elevation required in R322.2, R322.3, or R322.4, but I will tell you what that means. In an A zone, the required level of protection is base flood elevation plus 2 feet. And that would be this first section. R322.2 is A zones. R322.3 is for V zones, level of protection there. I haven't got the V zones, but I'll tell you now. Level of protection in a V zone is base flood elevation plus 3 feet. And this next section, R322.4, that is the coastal dune section, and I'll explain that when I get there, not too long from now. So stuff needs to be elevated above the required level of protection. There is an exception that applies only in A zones that says that you can have your utility, and it lists all the different stuff. You can have that stuff below the required level of protection if the equipment is designed and installed to prevent water from entering or accumulating. What that means is that equipment has to be submersible. It does not mean in an A zone in a residential construction, it does not mean that the equipment can be within a flood-proofed room or vault. It means the equipment itself has to be essentially submersible, like I said. Okay, flood-resistant materials. Again, flood-resistant materials have to be used below the required level of protection. Again, that means for A zones, base flood elevation plus 2 feet, base flood elevation plus 3 feet in V zones, and it specifically cites FEMA Technical Bulletin 2 here. So flood-resistant materials are determined by what's in FEMA Technical Bulletin 2. Tanks in A zones. Tanks in A zones can be underground or they can be above ground. In either case, they have to be anchored so they don't move around. They don't float away, that sort of thing. In an A zone, the tank can be elevated, but it is not required to be elevated above the required level of protection. It can be above ground, but not elevated, provided that it is properly anchored. Okay, Chapter 4, I told you I would tell you a little bit about Chapter 4. So Chapter 4 has this section, Chapter 4 Foundations, has this section that says, I hope you can't hear that, my neighbor's car alarm. Okay. Okay, so it has this section that says flood resistant, and it says number 2, for buildings that are in flood hazard areas. Number 2, finished ground level of the underfloor space shall be equal to or higher than the outside finished ground on at least one side. If you remember the definition of basement, what that means is that underfloor space, that enclosure, cannot be a basement. Now, there's an exception there that's been deleted. The exception was for use of FEMA Technical Bulletin 11, which describes crawl space construction that can be below grade on all sides. That has been deleted by amendment in our building code, so that technical bulletin is not used in Massachusetts. Okay, just a couple of the technical bulletins there. FEMA has a whole wealth of information and guidance for you that I find very helpful. I've read it all. You don't have to, but most of the questions you might have about these different things, you can probably find answers for in these technical bulletins. So Technical Bulletin 1 is 35 pages of everything you ever wanted to know about openings in foundation walls. So you can find a lot of helpful information there. I mentioned this already, flood damage resistant materials, technical bulletin 2. I think I have outdated versions of both of these, but if you do a Google search, you'll find the updated version. I think both of them, most of FEMA's technical bulletins have been updated in the last couple of years. Here is a picture that I got from Technical Bulletin 1 that I use just to show an enclosure that is not a basement because it is not below grade on all sides. You can see here the finished grade inside is the same as outside. You have a hydrostatic opening there that is not more than 12 inches above grade. A lot of people ask about walkout enclosures. Definition of basement that I talked about before said a basement is an enclosure which is below grade on all sides. So here's a walkout basement. If that enclosure is at grade on at least one side, it would not be a basement by definition. It would not necessarily be the lowest floor of this structure, provided it meets all of the other requirements that it would have to meet, which would include the use requirements, building access, parking, storage, use of hydrostatic openings, flood-resistant materials, that sort of thing. One more thing. So here you have a picture of a building that has an attached garage. So whenever you have a situation where you have more than one enclosure, each enclosure has to meet the requirements for hydrostatic openings. So each enclosure has to have minimum of 2 openings on different sides, meeting the requirement to have 1 square inch of opening for 1 square inch of enclosed floor space. And of course, bottom of the opening is not more than 12 inches above the higher of interior and exterior grade. So I have a couple of pictures. Here is a structure that appears to be compliant. Lowest floor is at designed flood elevation, which is base flood plus 2 feet. And it is not a basement, has an enclosure that's not a basement, and it has hydrostatic openings. So here would be your non-compliant construction. Unfortunately, I see this out there in the world. Sometimes people will say, well, we don't have utilities down there and we have the flood openings, but because it has an enclosure that's below grade on all sides, by definition, that is a basement. Also, by definition, it is the lowest floor, and therefore it does not meet the requirement that lowest floor is at design flood elevation or base flood elevation plus 2 feet. If you have a pre-existing structure that is substantially improved, typically that structure would have to come into compliance with today's code and including elevation requirements. If you were, say, just for instance, to build a second floor addition, and that work is determined to be a substantial improvement, you have to bring it into compliance, which typically means if it had a basement before, it can't have a basement after, and you have to have that lowest floor as defined at design flood elevation. Okay, you cannot have a below grade crawl space. I said before, FEMA has a technical bulletin 11, which allows below grade crawl spaces, but a lot of people don't read the fine print in that technical bulletin that says that it's only allowed if it is in the regulations that are adopted by the community. And in this case, the community is Massachusetts because our building code has been adopted at the state level. It applies to all communities. So our regulations do not allow that below grade crawl space. Okay, you can elevate in an A zone, you can elevate on fill, not allowed in a V zone, not ever. But again, you have to have all appropriate approvals to do this, and your lowest floor is at design flood elevation or base flood elevation plus 2 feet. In an A zone, you can elevate on piles. You're not required to, but you can, and your floor has to be at base flood elevation plus 2 or design flood elevation. After construction, you are required, building code requires that you have as-built documentation of that lowest floor, and it has to be certified. FEMA has a form called elevation certificate. Elevation certificate meets that requirement, but the building code does not require that that form be used to meet this building code requirement. That certified elevations are obtained and kept on record by the community for documenting the elevation of the lowest floor. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing because I'm done with A zones, but you're in luck because I have a whole other presentation to give you, and it's going to be about V zones, and the challenge is just to find it here when I'm trying to share it. And I
Eric,
think
while you're, you were so speedy.
I know.
We do have a couple of good comments and questions. One,
Okay.
Most recently, Thad is just clarifying, yes, the A zone that Eric was just talking about is the same thing as the MIWA that Rebecca was talking about. In the next section, Eric will cover those coastal A zones, or the MOA. That also mentioned, so you were talking about substantial improvement early on. Substantial damage also applies. Thad mentions that he's dealing with a property right now that was damaged due to fire. And the attorney tried to argue that they could rebuild the exact pre-fire structure, assuming this was in the floodplain.
Can I answer that instead of you?
Yes, yes.
Substantial damage means damage by any cause. It could be fire or flood or earthquake, damage by any cause. The cost to repair the structure to the pre-existing condition is more than 50% of the value of the structure before the damage. Repair of substantial damage is always, it's part of the definition of substantial improvement. I don't think I said that before. I'm glad that Thad brought it up. So it doesn't matter how the building was damaged. If it's been substantially damaged, repair of that building is by definition substantial improvement.
Thank you. And then we also have a question from Rob Conlon. How would you determine a commercial building containing a building containing 5 or more units substantial? So residential units, or maybe not. How would that be done? And he gives a specific example. Let's say the building is 1 million and it will cost one unit almost 500, or not quite 500,000 for rehab. Can you read that? Do you see that question?
Okay. Yeah, I can. I get that question a lot. I just got that from another community last week. There is in this case, a commercial building. It's kind of like a little strip mall, and the individual units are owned by different entities. If that is one building, when you are determining substantial improvement, you use the value of the whole building, not the value of the unit. I think that should answer the question.
I think so. That's one that we see a lot as well. Okay, that's all we have for now. And also I'll mention that Thad put in a link to the technical bulletins that Eric was referring to, and that's very helpful.
Okay.
All right, carry on.
So I'm going to put it in presentation mode, which sometimes takes more than one try. Oh, first try. Okay. So Massachusetts State Building Code, flood standards, and I'm going to, in this presentation, talk about, let's see if it's on the next. Oh my goodness, I shared the same stupid thing. I thought I got, wow. Let me do it again.
I think the same thing that happened to Rebecca is happening to you. Yeah, we could see in non-presentation mode the correct presentation, but when you went to presentation mode, it didn't do anything for us. No, that's the first one.
The same one. Sorry, I'm going to stop sharing. I know I have it open.
I know you do too.
I think I have it open. Okay. One of these days, they're going to fix stupid teams so that it's easier to find stuff. Okay,
Someday.
I think I found it. That look
That
right?
looks like, yep, that looks right, but not presentation mode yet.
Right. That's my next challenge.
All right.
Okay. Oh, darn. Sorry.
That's okay.
Okay. I think I'm almost there. Got it?
Got it.
Okay. So in this presentation, I am going to talk about coastal high hazard areas in the 10th edition, and I'm going to talk about what the changes are. Coastal high hazard areas, I said this before, but I'll say it again, include V zones and coastal A zones. I'm also going to talk about coastal dunes in this presentation. Again, coastal dunes are unique to Massachusetts, or at least the standards for coastal dunes are unique to Massachusetts. Other places have coastal dunes, they just don't have the standards that we have. So, design flood elevation. I said before, in the residential code, we define design flood elevation as base flood elevation plus required freeboard. In the 10th edition, that will be for V zones and coastal A zones. Design flood elevation is base flood elevation plus 3 feet. So in the 9th edition, it was plus 2 feet. In fact, in the 8th and the 7th edition, it was plus 2 feet, but that has changed. It is now base flood elevation plus 3 feet. So I have a picture. I put this in the presentation just in case you weren't paying attention when Rebecca was talking. So this is a coastal A zone and a LIMWA. Interestingly, this is Rebecca Road in Scituate, which may or may not have been named after Rebecca Haney, but I'm not sure about that. But anyway, you can you can see that the limit of moderate wave action is here, and you have the white line or gutter line between the A zone and the V zone. So this area right in here is your coastal A zone. So this is an example of a place where you will find a coastal A zone, and there are structures there that are in that coastal A zone. So under the 10th edition, we have specific standards that apply to coastal A zones, and they're the same standards that apply to V zones. We didn't have that in the previous editions of the building code, but here we are in the 10th edition. So your elevation requirement, you will find in R322.3. It applies to V zones and coastal A zones, and buildings and structures are to be elevated so that the bottom of the lowest horizontal structural member supporting the lowest floor is at or above design flood elevation, which is base flood elevation plus 3 feet. Basements are prohibited in V zones. Use of fill for structural support is also prohibited. So unlike the picture I showed you just 2 minutes ago, you cannot elevate on fill in a V zone or a coastal A zone for that matter. Okay, some more elevation requirement stuff. You can have minor placement of fill, and this has come up a few times in recent weeks. Minor fill, by FEMA's guidance, if you reference FEMA Technical Bulletin 5, minor amount of fill is 2 feet or less. So you can have minor placements of fill for landscaping and drainage purposes. You can even have in one of these zones, you can have walls enclosing the area below the elevated building. Those walls have to be breakaway walls, and the criteria for breakaway walls are in those sections that are cited. Here is a mass amendment, again, unique to Massachusetts, number 6. Lateral additions in V zones that are not substantial improvement are required to be elevated. A lateral addition that is a substantial improvement requires the whole house to be elevated. So those are some elevation requirements. Some more things, foundations. It says here, foundation is going to be an open pile or column foundation, and the space below that elevated building has to be free of obstruction, or it can be enclosed with breakaway walls.
Eric, I think
And
we've got a question specific to your
right.
previous slide.
Okay.
If Edwin Bowers wants to go ahead.
Yeah, so additions, you said that section of building code says only V zones, but it's high hazard period. Additions.
You know what? You're right, Ed. So that applies to coastal high hazard areas, which now include V zones and coastal A zones. Is that your question?
Correct, and the same with freeboard. So the FEMA guidance that is out there, the quick guide, you would go by high hazard, and they're both included.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Okay. So foundations have to be pile or column foundation. I said that already. So here is an exception for coastal A zones only. Okay. And this exception applies to both the residential code and the base code. So in a coastal A zone, you can meet the V zone standard that I talked about already, the open pile foundation with the bottom of the lowest at design flood elevation or base flood elevation plus 3 feet. But in a coastal A zone, you have the option of having a solid wall foundation that is backfilled inside the walls up to the level, the underside of the elevated slab. That is allowed in coastal A zones, but not in V zones. And it also applies to coastal A zone standards in both the residential code and the base code. In the base code, I've been giving you all residential code citations. In the base code, you will find all of the V zone and coastal A zone standards in chapter 4 of ASCE 2414. I didn't say this before. Just in case you want to buy a copy of ASCE 24, make sure you get ASCE 2414. That is the correct reference for our 10th edition building code. There is a newer version of ASCE 24 out. It's called ASCE 2424. The second 24 is 2024, the year 2024. That is not the correct standard for our 10th edition building code. So anyway, here is your exception for coastal A zones. And I'm trying to advance and I'm not having luck. Okay. Base code. There is another exception that applies in the base code, but not the residential code. And it says right down here, it says design and construction. I mentioned this before. That's why I call ASCE 24 and ASCE 7 required standards. And I usually don't say reference standard, but it says you have to be in compliance with these 2 volumes. But down here, again, in the mass amendments exception, existing non-residential structures do not have to meet coastal A zone standards if they are substantially improved. If a building, an existing building in a coastal A zone is substantially improved, it has to be brought into compliance with A zone standards, okay, but not coastal A zone standards. So we have that exception in the base code. So I already said this. Here is the citation I gave you before for breakaway walls. So they give you some design criteria and they say some important things like you should not be mounting utilities like electrical, mechanical, plumbing stuff on those walls that are designed to be breakaway. Would seem that that was intuitive, but you know, you want to say that in the code anyway. Sometimes people don't follow that standard, but so I'm telling you. Here's another
Eric,
thing. Yeah,
Joy would like to chime in.
I
Go
just
ahead,
had a question, Eric,
Yep.
on that previous slide. Is it still 20 pounds pressure? I thought it was reduced to 10 pounds pressure on number 3.
I can look that up if you want, but I'm going to have to wait until I take this off the screen. As far as
Yeah.
I know, that is what the standard is.
Okay, no problem. You can look it up later. Thanks.
Yep. Breakaway walls. If breakaway walls are used, they are required to have hydrostatic openings like you see here in this picture. And those hydrostatic openings have to meet the same requirements as hydrostatic openings in A zones. Enclosed areas below the base flood elevation have to meet the same use requirement, building access, parking, and storage. Tanks in V zones, they can be underground. They, of course, have to be anchored. If they are above ground, they have to be elevated to the same level of protection. Unlike an A zone, where you might have a tank that is not elevated, in a V zone, that tank has to be elevated. If it is on a platform, the platform has to be elevated above the same level of protection. Again, in coastal high hazard areas, V zones and coastal A zones, that level of protection is design flood elevation plus 3 feet. Protection of mechanical and electrical has to be above the required level of protection. And the same thing applies to the platform that I said about the tanks. Platform has to be, bottom of that platform has to be at or above design flood elevation. There's my picture of something in a V zone or coastal A zone. Elevated open pile foundation, bottom of that lowest horizontal structural member at DFE or base flood plus 3 feet. Coastal dunes, like I said before, coastal dunes are all Massachusetts amendments. There's where you will find the requirements for coastal dunes in R322.4 in the residential code, or chapter 16 and appendix G for the base code. Okay, so to issue a permit for something in a coastal dune, there is a map. It's called, it's got a clever name, Map of Coastal Wetlands Resources for Building Officials. Every building department might have that. If they don't, they can contact me. I'll tell you where to get it. But essentially, the determination of whether something is a coastal dune should be made by conservation. Conservation should be reviewing everything that's being built in a floodplain. But building inspector is supposed to have one of these following 4 documents prior to issuing a building permit. A is the one that would be the more common thing. That would be an order of conditions. That basically, it doesn't say that up on the screen, but the order of conditions has to allow what is proposed in the building permit. So the other documents here, B, C, and D, are documents that say it's outside of the coastal dune, or it might be inside the coastal dune, but the work is not significant to that resource area. So one of those 4, and the most likely being A, order of conditions that allows the proposed work. Requirements. Coastal dune standards apply to new construction, new foundations, replacement or substantial repair of a substantially damaged structure where the damage is result of storm or flooding. It applies to lateral additions, but it doesn't necessarily apply to every substantial improvement. So make sure if you're looking to issue a permit for something in a coastal dune, you understand what these standards apply to and what they don't apply to. So the elevation requirement in a coastal dune, let's see, foundation is going to be an open pile foundation. Enclosures are not permitted below the elevated building. And whoop, I screwed up. I went past the elevation. Okay, the elevation requirement is similar to a V-zone elevation requirement. The bottom of the lowest horizontal structural member supporting the lowest floor is at a location that's determined by conservation in that order of conditions. And I will add, a lot of times a coastal dune is also an A zone or a V zone. It could be an X zone, meaning outside of the floodplain, but when it's in an A zone or a V zone, the required elevation has to, at a minimum, be consistent with that A zone or V zone. But that elevation could be higher, and that's determined by conservation. And now I'm done.
Thanks, Eric. I also want to mention you had brought up tanks with
Yep.
A and V zones. In coastal dunes, sometimes it depends what the underlying zone is, but also sometimes conservation commissions will not allow a tank to be buried in a coastal dune. So
Okay.
it may have to be elevated, but that's up to your conservation commission. Okay, we have one question that came in from the chat. Folks, feel free to keep adding questions in the chat or raise your hand. The question from Eileen Coleman is, do the requirements in the new edition, the new building code edition, also meet the requirements of DEP with respect to filling in the floodplain?
I don't know necessarily that building code requirements that I described today meet the DEP requirements. I'm not familiar enough with those requirements to say, oh yeah, whatever you do here. And I think Rebecca might have something to say about that.
Yeah, so the requirements for the building code are meant for one purpose. Wetlands Act is meant for a different purpose. The Wetlands Act, one of the functions is to look at whether you're going to redirect flow to adjacent buildings. And so the standards are not final. We don't have what those are yet, and there'll be training on that when they do come out. But that's one of the things that you're looking at under the Wetlands Act right now is, are they going to redirect flow to adjacent areas and cause harm to others? So we'll have a standard that says whether it's avoid or minimize and what the details are when they promulgate the standards. But those are for two different purposes. So fill that may be allowed for building code purposes is not the same as fill under the Wetlands Act.
That's what I was going to say.
Okay, here's a good one. Is there anything in the building code regarding outdoor kitchens and in-ground pools in V zones and coastal A zones? Would either be allowed?
Let's see. Outdoor kitchens, I would refer to FEMA Technical Bulletin a few things. FEMA Technical Bulletin 5 for free of obstruction requirements, and also the requirements for protection of utilities. If the outdoor kitchen has a tank, for instance, you have to meet the requirement for, like, it has a propane tank, or if it has some other electric utility or some other thing, you would have to meet those requirements. Again, free of obstruction requirements, which are in the building code, but further explained in FEMA Technical Bulletin 5, and protection of stuff. And what was the other thing?
The second part is pools, in-ground
Oh,
pools.
pools. Pools are addressed in ASCE 24. I believe that's chapter 9 for miscellaneous construction. Typically in a V zone. Was this specifically about V zones?
V zones and coastal A, yep.
Oh, V zones and coastal A. I have heard, I've never seen, I've heard of an elevated pool. That elevated pool would have to be, would have to meet free of obstruction requirements, meaning everything above the V zone elevation, or in a V zone under building code, that pool could be in the ground.
Thank you. And sometimes conservation jumps in there too, depending on particular circumstances.
But they can't make an enclosure around it, right, Eric?
Correct.
Thanks, Joy. Okay, this may be a question more for Rebecca. Anything new about septic systems in coastal dunes? But either of you feel free to answer.
Corey, what's your question? I'm not sure what.
Well, I think she was asking, in the 10th edition of the building code, is there anything new about septic systems? Building code doesn't regulate septic systems, but Corey, feel free to jump in if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I was just wondering because a lot of times existing structures that are in coastal dunes want to replace their septic systems. Didn't know if there was any new regulation about that.
So it's more of a Board of Health issue, but what they do in a coastal dune still needs to meet Wetlands Protection Act. So particularly if it's there's an existing house, they're allowed to have to do an improvement to the septic system to make it better, but things like retaining walls, for example, are problematic in dunes. So there are certain components that are going to be challenging. So if you have a specific question with a project, feel free to reach out for help.
Thank you.
I've got an answer to Joy's question. Joy asked about my slide about breakaway walls, and the standard is correct that I had in my slide. The required resistance for breakaway walls is not less than 10, not more than 20 pounds per square foot.
Thanks.
Welcome.
Thank you. And thanks, Zach, for putting that in the chat too. A question, will the recording of this be shared? You had to jump off. Yes, it will be available. I have all of your emails because you've attended, and then it'll also be available on our website, and we'll have the slides as well. So yes. Now, Sean has a specific question, but before we get to that specific question, does anyone else have questions? Anything else that's come up? And I'll just reiterate, lots of folks available to help answer questions as you start to run into things, as you start to have these come up with the new building code. Well, one thing we should probably mention, July 1st is when the 10th edition becomes effective, so very soon, next week. Okay, Sean. Oh, go ahead, Rebecca.
I was going to say, there's one thing I forgot to mention. There are a few areas along the coast we've discovered where the LMWA in GIS was flipped and it faces the wrong way, and it doesn't even make sense. We think we found a lot of those, but if you find one that doesn't make sense, reach out. FEMA has a mechanism for getting that fixed, but I mean, based on you understanding that it needs to face the higher hazard area, there's a number of places that just don't make sense. If you have a question, feel free to reach out.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. I know I've seen some of those. Okay, we do still have a few minutes left. So Sean, if you want to bring up your specific question, I'm sure it's going to be helpful to others as well.
Hey, everybody. Hey, so as Shannon, as you know, I always get these fun ones that come up. And I sent you, Eric, I sent you a PDF.
I got it.
All right. So basically it's a V to an X boundary question where the house is not mapped within the V zone. It's mapped in the X. So, according to the CZM guidance, you take the grades around the building, and if the lowest adjacent grade is lower than the BFE for the V zone, then the house is actually located within the V zone. First, I'm just making sure that is the correct determination.
I'm going to answer that and say, if that house is not shown in the V zone, and you're certain of this, the house is not in the V zone as it is shown on that map, I would say the building code V zone standards don't apply to that house. I want to take a closer look at what you sent me.
Yeah.
I didn't open any of the attachments, but do you have a plan showing elevations and things like that? What I'll do is I'll look at the map. I'll look at the stuff you sent me. I don't want to do that kind of answer off the top of my head, but broadly speaking, I would say if that house is very clearly not in the V zone as mapped, I would say V zone requirements don't apply to it.
I'll follow up with you after.
Okay.
Yeah, the guidance is for Wetlands Protection Act. It's not the way the building code is written.
Thank you, everybody. And with Sean's example, with Thad's example, a lot of these come up, and a lot of you are running into the same issues. So good to share with everybody. All right, anything else? All right. Great. Well, thank you all for attending and for sticking with us. Lots of good information. Oh, we've got one question. What is FEMA's timeline in adopting the new NAVD, the new National Vertical Datum that NOAA is proposing to roll out in the next few years?
Again, I will say I don't know specifically what their plan is for that, but don't expect to see that on any of our maps anytime soon, because we have maps that are just going effective now. Those are all referenced to NAVD 88, and I would also suspect maps that are already underway and near the point of being adopted. I'm guessing those are going to continue to be referenced to NAVD 88. I'm saying this as a guess. I have not heard this addressed from anyone from FEMA.
John just said, who is with FEMA, for folks who don't know John Grace, he can ask headquarters and try to get an answer to me, and then I could get that out to you.
I didn't know John was there.
John is
That's
here,
a better
yes.
answer than mine.
Good question, though. Any others? Maria, go ahead.
On the 10th edition becoming effective July 1st, how do building code officials regulate, say a project gets submitted before, like say right now in June, do you go by the 9th edition or the 10th edition for rules?
If the building permit application is received before July 1st, as I understand it, it's up to the applicant which building code edition. I think most would choose the 9th edition if they're in a floodplain, but it's just what I tend to see. I'm wondering if I saw Rob Anderson at some point. He might be out there somewhere, but I don't know if he's still here.
Yeah, Rob, if you're here, do you have anything to add?
I am here.
Great.
Yes. I was hoping you wouldn't call on me though, but yeah, that's exactly correct. Is as long as you get your application in prior to that deadline, you may get permitted under the 9th edition. That's choose, but you have to stay within the 9th. You can't start choosing things that you like in the 10th edition or the 9th.
Right.
If you're in the 9th, you're in the 9th. If you're in the 10th, you're in the 10th.
Thanks, Rob.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry we didn't let you keep hiding.
Well, at least you didn't call on me for that example. That was good. I probably would have flunked miserably.
Any other questions? All right. Great. Well, thanks, everybody. Thanks so much, Rebecca and Eric. This